Good evening, everybody. My name's Ann Clark. I'm a volunteer with Friends of the Schindler House, also known as FoSH. I have been working with the development committee for the Friends of the Schindler House for the last couple of years. And a couple of years ago, we decided that we wanted to engage a larger community. And so we started Schindler Talks. Tonight, you will experience another. Tonight's talk is called King's Roadhouse, the Next 100 Years, and you will learn a lot about what our plans for to restore and preserve this amazing treasure. I do want to thank a lot of people who have joined us before and any newcomers, people who have supported this house, both financially, physically, emotionally, and any other way. There's been a lot of support in the last few years. I want to also thank the guests who you will meet soon. Some of these people have been involved a long time, some people new, but they all are committed to making the Schindler House a permanent fixture in our architectural world. I also want to thank the MAC for all of their continued financial and support and through the CMP, which you'll learn about that soon, and all of our donors who have participated in providing funding and support for this really incredible piece of work. I want to introduce to you Emily. Where are you, Emily? I don't see you. I think she just lost her internet. She's struggling with her internet, so we're going to wait a few minutes until she comes back. It's in and out. But Emily Varley, who you'll see shortly, I might as well just introduce her, is an architectural historian at Historic Resources Group in Pasadena, California. She holds a master's degree in urban planning and a master's degree in heritage conservation from the University of Southern California. Her thesis investigated the vernacular architecture of a property in South Carolina, which she researched while working for the National Park Service. In 2017, she had been involved in the San Giuliano Archaeological Research Project in Lazio, Italy, participating in excavation and documentation as well as conducting field surveys. And she's based in Los Angeles. So I think we're still having problems getting her on. We'll wait another minute. She's coming back and forth. And a little bit of housekeeping too. Please know that we are recording this session, and eventually we will get it up on either our website, or we're developing how we're going to be sharing the video right now. Emily is back with us, so stay tuned for that and check our website, and we'll continue to send. We don't send a lot of emails because we don't want to bother people, but if when we get that up and running, we'll send out a follow-up email. Questions and answers, please just put into the Q&A, and we'll be monitoring those throughout the talk. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily and ask Emily to share her thoughts a little bit about the Schindler House, and she's going to take it away from here. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Anne, and hello, everyone. My name is Emily. My apologies that my internet was struggling there for a little bit. As I just said, my name is Emily Varley. I'm an architectural historian at Historic Resources Group in Pasadena. And I am really delighted to be moderating this conversation tonight on the Kings Road House Conservation Master Plan. And I'm looking forward to introducing you all to our wonderful speakers and the work that they're doing to conserve the Schindler House. And then I'm sure Anne just mentioned this when I was briefly off, but you can submit questions and comments in the Q&A chat feature. And then we will be reading and responding to those at the end of our discussion and then the presentation. And then this meeting is going to be recorded and posted. And then we're aiming to conclude our webinar in an hour at 5:30. And the reason I'm here today is because I really love modern architecture, but when I did my internship in the city of West Hollywood, I was just delighted to learn about the Schindler House and Schindler's Life and Crazy Guy and Pauline, and just, I mean, just a really, really wonderful place to visit and really an oasis in Los Angeles. So thank you so much for being here with us today. And without further delay, I will start by introducing you all to our first speaker, which is Frank Escher. So Frank, he trained at the ETH. My apologies if you're hearing this siren in Pasadena. Frank trained at the ETH in Zurich. He's been in partnership with, maybe I should wait a second. Okay. With Robbie GuneWardena at Escher GuneWardena Architecture since 1995. Their firm's work ranges from residential to commercial, institutional, and art-related projects. Historic preservation projects include Lautner's Chemosphere, the Eames House, Phase 1, the A.Q. Jones Pilot House, and Paul Revere Williams' private residence. Currently, they are working on Lautner's 1939 private residence, as well as Richard Neutre's 1929 Lovell Heath House. Having edited the first comprehensive monograph on architect John Lautner, Escher has served on the boards of the Los Angeles Forum for Architecture and Urban Design, the John Lautner Foundation, and the Julius Schulman Institute. And he co-curated Between Earth and Heaven, The Architecture of John Lautner, published through the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. And Escher is a member of the FoSH MAC Conservation Committee. And then our next speaker is Kyle Normandin. Kyle is a principal at Janney Elstner Associates Incorporated with over 25 years of experience in historic preservation. And Kyle is also an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. And his research focuses on the conservation of historic building materials. Kyle was formerly a senior project specialist at the Getty, where he was part of the Conserving Modern Architecture Initiative, and now he serves as the associate editor for the Journal of Architectural Conservation. Kyle is the principal advisor and team leader for the Schindler House CMP. And then our next speaker is Kaitlin Drisko. Kaitlin is a Los Angeles historic preservation architect dedicated to innovative strategies for conservation of our heritage resources. Trained in both architecture and engineering, Kaitlin has practiced in the field of preservation for over 30 years on large and small projects, studies, and documentation, and in roles as lead design team manager or as a technical consultant to other architects. Centering collaboration as an essential part of successful endeavors, Kaitlin serves on the Friends of the Schindler House Preservation Committee to help organize and steward Rudolph M. Schindler's Kings Road House for the benefit of future generations. And then our final speaker is Cathy Garrett. Cathy is the president of PGAdesign Incorporated, a landscape architecture firm in Oakland, and specializes in the preservation of landscape architecture with experience in New York, England, her native Australia, and California. In addition to working on the Schindler House CMP, Cathy has recently worked on modernist landscape projects such as Ted Osmundson's Kaiser Roof Garden and the collection of Worcester, Bernardi, and Emmons structures at the Marin Art and Garden Center. Cathy is a past president of the California Preservation Foundation, a founding chair of the Northern California chapter of the Historic American Landscape Survey, former board member of the National Association of Olmsted Parks, and has served on the Historic State Capitol Commission in Sacramento. So following our speaker sections, we are going to be opening up the conversation to discuss what is unique about the Schindler House CMP and how it's going to lead us into the future of the conservation of this property. Thank you again for being here today. We are super excited. And Frank, I will hand it over to you to begin.
First of all, I want to thank FoSH and Leslie Thomas and Anne Clark in particular for organizing these talks. And I want to thank you, Emily, also on behalf of the panel for these introductions. I always say the exact same thing when I speak about the Schindler House. It is one of the most significant houses of the 20th century. We can place this house in the same category as Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie, Mises' Tugendhat House, Pierre Charot's Maison de Verre, or closer to home, the Eames House or the Lovell Health House, the plans of which, by the way, were drawn up at the Schindler King's Road House. The house is as radical today as it was 100 years ago when it was first built. Schindler introduces, or one should maybe say, reintroduces to Western domestic architecture the concept that a space is not assigned a function, but instead each space is assigned to a different individual who works or sleeps or eats or entertains in their particular space. There are 4 studios, 2 each share an entrance, a bath, and on the roof, an open sleeping porch or basket. And most importantly, 2 studios always share a garden patio that functions as an outdoor living space. There are 2 dwelling units. They share a kitchen, and there's also a small guest studio and a garage. Now, Rudolf Schindler lived in the house until his death in 1953. Pauline Schindler until her death in 1977, with some intervals where she was absent, and despite the fact that they had separated in the mid-1920s. We know that Pauline Schindler was centrally involved in creating this house. She wrote about the house that she would like to have long before she met Rudolf Schindler. And it was Pauline Schindler who had the foresight to create in 1976, 1 year before she died, the organization Friends of the Schindler House, or FoSH, to protect the house and to ensure its survival. In 1980, FoSH acquired the house and undertook a very significant restoration. It is important to understand that the house as it is seen today is not what the house looked like in the late 1970s. Pauline Schindler had made alterations to the house. She famously painted walls, she installed floor tiles, she replaced sliding screens with sliding glass doors, all of which was reversed. FoSH also installed the garden as it exists now, based on drawings by Rudolf Schindler. In 1994, the MAC Center for Art and Architecture was established at the house. The MAC Center is a satellite of the MAC, Museum für angewandte Kunst, or Museum of Applied Art, founded in Vienna in 1863. The MAC is a federal museum, and it is, after the V&A in London, the 2nd oldest museum of applied arts in the world. An agreement between FoSH and MAC outlines who does what. FoSH owns the house and is in charge of maintaining the house. The MAC makes yearly financial contributions towards the maintenance of the house. The MAC effectively operates the house, opening the house and staffing the house and giving tours. And the MAC is responsible for programming the house, exhibitions, lectures, events, really continuing the legacy of the Schindlers of using the house as a place for cultural and social exchange. Now, about 2 years ago, the FoSH MAC Conservation Committee was established to better coordinate conservation issues between the 2 organizations. And it is made up of people representing both organizations. So in that committee, we have Kaitlin Drisko, who is on the panel. We also have the preservation architect Peyton Hall, who I describe as the éminence grise of historic preservation in Los Angeles. He's a former FoSH board member who knows the house extremely well. We have TK McClintock, who is a conservator and the founder of TKM Associates, a conservation studio in Boston. They've worked on museum conservation around the world, and TK has worked on Frank Lloyd Wright projects. And we also have the historian Bob Sweeney, who is also the president of FoSH and who oversaw the 1980s restoration. Representing the MAC, we have Andrea Lenardin-Marden, a well-known Austrian architect based in Los Angeles. She first came here through the MAC residency program about 30 years ago and has since been connected to the MAC and the Schindler House, and then myself. So this is a group of people with a very broad range of professional experience and expertise. And about 2 years ago, this conservation committee started the conversation about the need to have a CMP. We discussed this with our respective organizations, and we have now embarked on this CMP process. FoSH, as the owners of the house, is managing the process while both organizations are jointly overseeing this process, and both organizations are equally sharing the costs for this. It goes without saying that both organizations are fully dedicated to protecting and conserving this very important cultural asset.
Thank you, Frank. I think we're going to hear from Kyle next. And would you like me to share the PowerPoint now, Kyle?
Really just wait a second while I get going here. Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks, everyone, and to be part of this panel. I wanted to start off by discussing our approach on the development of the Conservation Master Plan, which also has the same acronym as a conservation management plan, but obviously not the same thing. So I just wanted to make that distinction early on for those of you who are following the different terminologies. But I think for the Kings Road House, one of the most important things that we have been asked to do is to preserve not only the legacy of the house, its setting and its place, but also to really look at the integral impact and collaboration with the Mack Center for Art and Architecture and the Friends of the Schindler House. I think, as Frank pointed out, our current work on the Conservation Master Plan really aims to create a holistic understanding of the place and its cultural significance. This includes really looking at the different uses, the stakeholders, making decisions about potentially its future use, not only looking at how it's used today, but also what it could be in the future. And I think that's really interesting. It's very important. Our team has really been asked to develop a master plan with a focus on the conservation of the house and its setting, but it's also going to be looking not only at the material fabric, but really trying to gain an understanding of the heritage values that could be used as a roadmap for its future use. So there's a big connection there. Emily, can you go to the first slide?
Oh no, okay, I think I lost my hosting capabilities when I got kicked off. And if you are out there, I would love to be host again so that I can share my screen. Okay, thank you. Let's see. Okay, can you all see this? I believe.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful.
So as we get started here, I think, as many of you are familiar, we are using and relying on a number of standards and guidelines for the development of the plan, critical for understanding the Kings Road House. Of course, we are looking at the United States Secretary of Interior standards, which we all know is really a guidance document for preserving, rehabilitating, and restoring historic buildings, and looking mainly at material fabric. But I think we really wanted to broaden our references to more ECOMOS charters and guidelines, such as the case that you see here with the Borough Charter. This really provides a broader framework for following various stages of understanding the significance of heritage places, both tangible and intangible values, and combining that with the physical evidence and attributes of the site. But building off of the Borough Charter, as many of you might also be familiar with the Madrid New Delhi document, which looks at unique approaches to the conservation of 20th century cultural heritage. I think it's important to note this document, which was came out and first published in 2017, went through a few iterations before seeing its current version that you see here. It's a really highly collaborative document that was developed across a number of ICOMOS international scientific committees, and mainly led by the Scientific Committee on 20th Century Heritage. So it's a very highly collaborative document that that is being used across the field. And I think it's truly remarkable because this guidance document really sets a new benchmark for a standard of conserving and managing heritage places of the 20th century. And of course, it's translated in over 20 different languages internationally. So it is being used on a wide scale internationally. Next slide, please. I think the approach and methodology that we're using at the moment, these guidelines are providing a roadmap for some of the steps that we're taking in terms of the initial planning process, which has been occurring over the last 3 or 4 months. We're looking at a lot of archival research with the MAC and FoSH partnership. We're also having lots of discussions looking at oral histories of people that are well known to the place, as well as looking at analysis of fabric and identifying all the stakeholders, but as well really looking at not only the architectural surveys, but we're also doing landscape surveys. So I think this is all very critical in order to be able to analyze this data as part of the condition assessment, because we will be undertaking structural assessments of the site and looking at all the different construction techniques that will help us to do a comparative analysis and really develop a statement of significance that is custom to this place. And after that, I think once we get those things in action, we'll be able to really start to look at the guidelines that would be used for, with the stakeholders of the site and the use of the site in the future. So that's kind of where we are, and I think we'll continue now, Emily, with the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Kyle. And I believe Kaitlin is up next.
Yes, thank you. So I'll tag on to what Kyle was describing and just talk a little bit about the acronym CMP for a minute and how the FoSH and MAC team came to the decision to produce this as a conservation master plan. So I'll give you a little background on the reason we decided to focus on the materiality of this place and the conservation of the extant materials. As Emily mentioned, I serve as on the FoSH Preservation Committee, of which I'm co-chair with Peyton Hall, who is a leading historic preservation architect and educator. And the FoSH Preservation Committee was charged with commissioning the CMP and getting the process started. The FoSH Preservation Committee is responsible for the repairs and improvements that preserve the Schindler House and site, as Frank described. And our committee follows at this time, we're following the Secretary of the Interior standards for preservation. Now that some of the alterations had been reversed, or the restoration phase, as Frank described it, in the 1980s, our charge is really to protect and conserve the remaining important features of the house. So we found that in executing these preservation projects, we were running into some interesting puzzles. We began a project last year in conjunction again with the MAC, with co-funding and also the beginning of this relationship of the Conservation Committee with Frank Escher and Andrea Normandin. And we began a project we thought was just going to be simple and replace the roof on the project, on the building.
So we began that project and took the existing roofing, and it quickly became apparent that the work really needed guidance and long-term strategy. Even what seemed like this standalone task, like a re-roofing project to protect the building from water intrusion, revealed itself to hold a multitude of choices and relationships that were extremely important aspects of the building. The project quickly became a master class in historic preservation and conservation experts, as you've heard, many of whom are within FoSH and MAC. We all began working together with Schindler historians, standing on the roof, discussing all aspects of its materials and installation. It also became apparent that the issues are technical and complicated by the house's basic structure, being both the exterior and the interior finishes. The building does not have a typical envelope that covers and conceals the structure. What you see is both the exposed exterior cladding and the interior finish. So though there are a few materials in the project, wood, concrete, insulate, canvas, glass, these materials are all exposed to view and most of them to weather as well. And importantly, most of these materials are pretty much original to the structure. In other words, R.M. Schindler placed the concrete and the redwood structure that we see today. So we learned in this process that the conservation issues are not straightforward. Each is like a three-legged stool. You have the geotechnical soils and the site drainage, all impacting the structural foundations. You have grading, planting, and site water control that are all interrelated. You have unique architecture, as Frank has described, that's combined with uses and daily functions and storage. You have lighting and electrical distribution that's integrated or exposed by the building envelope. You have physical concerns, we encountered user concerns, and history. It's all historical. And of course, the key components of the architecture: space, light, materials, and views. So because of this connectedness, the analysis needs to be done by a multidisciplinary team that works very closely together. And even within the disciplines, we've learned there's a continuum of expertise, from history and theory to materials and constructability. So sometimes, and in some cases, this implies two different team members for the same discipline. So working with the FMCC, as Frank has described, FoSH and MAC embarked on a project to select a team that could execute a conservation master plan. We selected with Janney Elstner, WJE, due to their breadth of both multidisciplinary technical expertise and knowledge, as well as their hands-on implementation experience. Their willingness to add experts in areas they didn't have specific knowledge in was also extremely crucial. And they were willing to work with an owner, as you've heard described, that has a daunting array of expertise itself, with board members that are expert historians and committee members that are active preservation, conservation, and construction professionals. They're willing to dive right in with us. So we have just completed the CMP Phase 1, Developmental History and Statement of Significance, during which time the FoSH and the MAC team imparted as much information as the CMP team could take on. And their team has begun to identify both intangible and tangible issues that need to be addressed by the Conservation Master Plan. The next phase, as Kyle was describing, is going to be a conditions assessment. And now the house, the site, and the landscape will begin telling their own stories to the CMP team. And I think you're going to hear a little bit about that next from Cathy Garrett.
Cathy, just let me know if you'd like me to share the screen now, share your PowerPoint slides now.
In just a moment. Thanks, Emily.
Welcome.
So hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and really to bring the landscape perspective on the CMP to the conversation. When I think of the Schindler House, I really think of it not as a house, but as an entire property and as a cultural landscape. That's a phrase that's been used for decades, but to sort of put a focus on it, it's a very encompassing and inclusive concept. And it really starts to look at the geographic area and everything that's associated with it, from historic events, activities, people, cultural and aesthetic values. So that inclusivity is how we're approaching the landscape here as a team. In an effort to better understand R.M. Schindler, we've of course turned to his writings, firsthand the voice of the guy. And in his 1912 manifesto, he established the framework of thinking, his thinking about architecture. And there's a few quotes from it which we could spend the afternoon on, but I'll move a little bit more quickly than that, but to focus on space architecture, a phrase he used. And one quote is that the architectural design concerns itself with space as its raw material. So Kaitlin was just describing the conservation of materials. How do you conserve space is part of the conversation. So now would be a good time for the first slide. Thanks, Emily. In Schindler's 1932 article for the journal T-Square, he spoke specifically about the King's Road House. And in it, he included this plan that he drew. So it's, again, from the source. And he described the property and the building. And in particular, there's a phrase that I think is a set of phrases that are helpful. He describes the architectural scheme. Each room in the house represents a variation on one structural and architectural theme. This theme fulfills the basic requirement for a camper's shelter: protected back, an open front, a fireplace, and a roof. Now that could describe architecture, and in fact it does, but it also describes what we think of as landscape elements. And so backing up just a little bit, how was the property developed? It took a little over a year to build, was completed in, I'll use the word completed, it was almost completed in June 1922. Of course, money ran low, and so they managed to do a lot of it, but not quite all that they'd meant. For instance, much of the planting arrived incrementally over time. But what that early plans, the early drawings show during the time of implementation is that Schindler was thinking about this concept of space and was pushing down into the fabric of the earth, into the earth, as well as building up from it, not only to ceiling height, but of course also to clerestory. And so there's this sense of a great sensitivity towards three-dimensionality. As was mentioned, the patios are living rooms. Each has walls, fireplace, and at times a canopy as a partial roof. There's a definition of the camper's shelter. And the space itself starts to radiate out from the center. You can see it's a bit of a pinwheel. And if we go to the next slide, you can see even more that it's a pinwheel. So that first drawing was by Schindler. This is from the Historic American Building Survey set. And it's useful because it's a 3D and you can see the pinwheel pattern. You perhaps get a sense of how space is flowing, and space, if we think of it as this raw material, perhaps space is more important or of greater purpose to discuss than perhaps some of the physical elements, even though they themselves define the space. So how important are thresholds, for instance, is a question. But in turn, looking at the Historic American Building Survey drawing, it's a terrific opportunity to see the three-dimensionality of the structure. But because it was prepared as part of the building survey, it focuses on the structure. And I think what it misses is that the currency was space, not so much building. And it misses some of that flow that goes right out to the limit site. So 1922, it was completed. The project was really at the frontier of development in the area at the time. Immediately south of here, it was just fallow land at the time of its completion. But 8 years later, the neighborhood was substantially built, although that didn't really impact the experience of the Schindler House and its property because it's a very inward-looking site plan. And so I think, how do we start to understand change over time? We see the environment change, but then again, by 1939, there's uncontrolled, rampant growth of vegetation. And by now, the camper's dwelling is really in a forest. So looking at the next slide and shifting a little bit, we're contributing to the conservation master plan. And of course, that development is ongoing, as we've discussed. There are just a couple of the pages from the developmental table. This is the first, and it shows the date, what occurred, and some reflection upon it. But it does it in some detail, and it includes both the physical characteristics as well as the social events of the time that had bearing on it. And from this exercise, we start to see, if we can go to the next slide, it is just another page from that same developmental table. Things that start to emerge are important periods that are reflected in the site. We've heard a lot of these dates already this evening. 1922 to 27, when Rudolph and Pauline lived there together with the Chasers at first. 27 to 40, Rudolph lives there, but without Pauline. She's moved out. 1940 to 1953, they're both there, but they're not together. They're occupying the house separately, in a sense. And until 1953, when Schindler passes away at 65. And then from 53 to 1977, there's the Friends of the Schindler House is about to be formed, but Pauline is living out her days there until age 84. Before she does pass away, Friends of the Schindler House is formed, and by 1980, they acquire the property. And in 1994, the cooperation agreement between FoSH and the Republic of Austria is established. And so there's this continuity. It's going to keep going from now forward, of course, as well. But how do we position the property as a whole to be understood in a comprehensive way? So I'm going to stop, but there's many more things I'd love to touch on, not the least of which is how the Schindler House tracks the development of attitudes to historic preservation in the US. But to close with just a quote again from Schindler that comes from his manifesto, again, 10 years before the property was built. And he describes the modern dwelling and that it will be quiet, a quiet, flexible background for a harmonious life. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you, Cathy, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, speakers. It's always so delightful to hear and learn from you guys. And I know we've been practicing this, so I've heard it a little bit, but it was just delightful. I'm delighted. And you guys did a wonderful job explaining the conservation master plan. So now we're going to transition into a discussion on, we're going to start with what our speakers find unique about the Schindler House CMP specifically, and then how you all see it leading us into the future of conserving the cultural heritage of this site, as well as others that may be looking to this CMP as a model. And then from there, we're going to open it up to our attendees and see if anyone has any questions or comments they would like to share. But would any of our speakers like to start off the discussion on kind of why you think this CMP is unique and how you see it leading us forward in the future?
Maybe I start. So a CMP, as we now have heard, is really a roadmap on how to conserve a building or a site. And each building or each site is actually different, is unique. So in a way, every CMP that has to be very carefully tailored to the object or the place that it is dealing with will be unique to the task. I think in this case, certainly one of the challenges maybe is that there are various different entities involved. There are essentially two organizations. That's not typically the case. I believe that normally there is a client who commissions a CMP, and they are the ones using the house or the site. But then there's also, of course, there's times when there are two or three or maybe more entities involved. And so this certainly creates some challenges about how does one gather information, how does one coordinate needs, and how does one address all of this. There are many other unique challenges to this. I think that Kaitlin started to speak about that. I'm in particular thinking about sort of the method of construction and the materials, and maybe actually, Kaitlin, you can continue on this and speak about some of the challenges that this sort of unique collection of materials poses.
Sure. I think, I mean, what's extraordinary about the house is it's, and again, it became very evident to us the more we've spent time there, the more we've been working. It has a very high degree of physical integrity. Even though, as it's been described, there's been some changes, and there's been some changes and alterations that have been reversed. You can feel the authenticity in the spaces, and that begins to create a really challenging and unique set of conditions, and that's why we had decided to really focus on this conservation master plan, because what we can really, this group, as you're hearing, is so well qualified to be able to leave this house with this roadmap that carries both the theory, the spirit, the ability to present Schindler's work through the work of Mac. In other words, as Frank's describing, the Mac is more than a lessor or a renter of the space. They are integral to the presentation of the spirit of the Schindler House in this form. So it really felt important to focus on what are the physical components that should be retained in order to keep that authenticity. So very quickly it became, as I was describing and as Frank's describing, it became a very technical and physical necessity as more than management, which is why we decided to focus it on this roadmap of a conservation master plan, so that the entities, because as Frank's describing, the governance and the entities are complicated, but if we have a roadmap and know what to do next, what's the important next step, what's the priority based on all of these important issues, that's really going to help maintain the house and protect it for the future. So that's, I think, how internally, we all struggled. CMP, Conservation Master Plan, Conservation Management Plan. And we really, as a team between FoSH and Mac, we really landed strongly in the master plan sense. So I think Kyle or Cathy, you might be able to pick up on that.
Sure. I mean, I completely agree, Kaitlin and Frank. I mean, the physical condition of the house is something that we're about to really start to understand and assess. I think part of that process really is going to be to take a deep dive and understand the vulnerabilities and risks of the site. And I think we started to talk a little bit about that with, perhaps some of the geological issues that need to be looked at in more detail. And then just looking at the construction of the house and how it's fared over time. I think really understanding what some of the vulnerabilities are is part of this process. So we're going to get into that very soon, and hopefully that will be able to generate information that we need going forward that will contribute and thread into the plan for the future retention. Cathy?
Much has been said, and I think you've covered it, but I will say the unique qualities not only of Schindler and his thinking, but also of the current leadership, ownership between FoSH and Mac is really important. It's a change of use. It's not a residence. It's open to the public. It gets different wear and tear. And of course, it's living. The building itself has animate qualities, but the site itself is living. And how do you manage that in the long run and think of it and conceive of it as part of the art? And of course, there's space, Schindler's attitude to space.
And I guess I'll add to that, and the difficulties ahead. And once we do identify the vulnerabilities and the needs, as I described, the house has no place to hide anything. Everything is open and exposed, and it's really going to be that I think might be what is truly extraordinary, going to be as truly unique about this project is the need to really be respectful and understanding of how we're going to create these treatments without impacting that authenticity.
Mm-hmm. And maybe I can also add to that a little bit of discussion that we had in our conservation committee, where because again, one of our members is a conservator, Tiki McClintock, who's actually worked more on objects, museum objects, but there was a lot of discussion about that this house in a way has to be treated as if it were a museum object, which is slightly different from how you treat a building or how you treat a site. And it is this sort of combination of a building that is accessible to the public, that one can visit, but it is also this object that tells a history, that talks about a very specific moment in the cultural history of the city of Los Angeles, speaks very eloquently about Schindler's career, what he did before he built the house, and of course what he did after he built the house. And so there are many more layers to this than you would typically address in a house or in a building. And I think this makes it sort of a very unique challenge, but also an extremely interesting one. That everything we do has to be looked at from sort of different, through different lenses almost, and how you treat an object may be different from how you treat a building. And here we actually have to do both. And so I know that this will be a very interesting ongoing conversation with the CMP team. They are all absolutely aware of these challenges, and these projects are always, they always require a small army of people, of experts, of historical specialists, of technical specialists, of people who know how to actually execute this work. So they are really interesting projects that require input from many different people, many different entities on many different levels.
Yeah, I'm gonna take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, there's some questions there. Do you see them, Emily?
Yes, I can
I
see
also,
them.
there's some people here who aren't really familiar with the house, and we don't have slides of the house. So I'm going to try to share my screen.
There is one more slide of an aerial view from the 1990s, which does sort of show the plan of the house, but it's a
Emily, can you get me to share, please?
Oh yes, let's see. Who can share? Host and panelists. Okay, hopefully you should be able to now. And but this property is located in West Hollywood on Kings Road. And then hopefully while you're seeing this
photograph of the house, I just pulled something up that's sort of a bit of an iconic view of the house. So Ellen, I hope that helps you give you some idea of what it is. Go ahead, Emily. There's lots more questions.
Yes. So I guess actually coming off of this question, sort of placing ourselves in this landscape, we had some questions about what have been your all's experiences at the house? Like, what was your first emotion or thought when you first visited the house? So if anyone, and then kind of going off of that, what do you think this site has to teach us for kind of the future? I guess those are two different questions, but how was your emotional experience and first thoughts when you first encountered this property? And then what do you think it looks like in the future going forward, and what can we learn from the property?
Well, maybe I'm sorry.
You go first, Frank.
Okay. Maybe I will just start. I think art, and I will include good architecture in this sort of under this heading, has the ability to move the viewer or the listener or whoever it is. And I'm not sure that this is only at the first time that you encounter something. And in particular, a house or a building, the experience that you have will change from day to day. It changes on what time of the day you're there, what the light is like, what the sound is like. I've been to that house many times. I do remember the first time just being moved in the same way I was moved when I first walked as a 5-year-old child into St. Mark's in Venice. I was just kind of trying, I just realized kind of the power that architecture has. But I really don't think that is sort of unique to the first time you experience something. And this place in particular, I've seen this on many occasions. People who come there, it really has the power of sort of calm you down in a way to because of how it is also built. Cathy described this very beautifully. It has the ability to sort of block out the environment in a way, even though now you see the sort of apartment building that looms over the house on the north side and another one on the south side. But you feel very protected. You feel very in a very sort of serene space, and it has as a place the ability to just move you and put you in a different set of mind.
That was what I was going to describe too, Frank. You've captured that eloquently. I think every time I go there, it's always a reminder that, wow, this is a different way of living. This building expresses a joy and a connectedness and a calm and transformative experience that that you just say, wow, this is life. This is a way of living that is comfortable, joyous, peaceful. And then you see the pictures, in the courtyard of Schindler entertaining, and it just it's exciting. And as Frank was describing, it's there's nothing like that feeling, and watching other people experience that when they first see it for the first time, it's transformative.
Anybody else? I wanted to read this question. It sounded like something unique about the site is that the site, indoor and outdoor, was designed not for a specific function, but for users and people. What are the implications about this for conservation? I guess not preserving the changes that users made, like Pauline. Does it mean that there are ephemeral components that need to be kept somehow, or are there materials that somehow preserve the role present significance of the use in Schindler's design? Big question.
I think that question really speaks to what we've been just discussing, which is some of the intangible values of things that people feel when they go to the site. And I think it has a lot to do with the space that Schindler created in and around the landscape and the gardens. And there's this connection that is quite unique to the form of the place. And I think those intangible values are worth protecting. And those are the things that we're looking at. And we don't know yet exactly how that will play out, but we are paying very close attention to those things. Absolutely.
And Emily, I don't know if you have the organizational chart, if you received that. It might be worth showing at this point to just show the extraordinary effort that to answer this very question, that with Janney has put together this incredible team of advisors and specialists in, and I'll let Cathy speak to this, that it's not just the as landscape alone. It's not just capturing that cultural landscape knowledge, but it's also incorporating that with a landscape architect, Lisa Gimme, who then can look at this from a very architecture, site design aspect. So this is how hard this is. I just want to commend the With Janney team for putting together this extraordinary group of people, as you're seeing, not just basic structure materials or geotechnical, but also very specific structural advisors like Michael Krakauer, or the consulting team members for historical architecture, all the way from materials conservation to cultural landscape design to a historical architect. Because With Janney recognized immediately that it will take this cross section of thinkers and philosophers, along with the ability to craft and think about the house as a work of art. As with RLA, it's almost as if it's a sculpture, but then also to just execute the needs for the basics of fire life safety or irrigation in a way that's sympathetic and will retain all of those intangible characteristics. So I just wanted to have everybody see what an extraordinary team it is coming together to answer some of these really important questions. Yeah. Thank you, Emily.
Maybe I can, if I understand the question correctly, there seems to be a question about how does something that was designed as a house function as a public place, if I understood this correctly. But there is kind of a misunderstanding there, which is that, Schindler, or the Schindlers, I should say, Rudolf and Pauline Schindler, when they designed the house, they really saw this as a place to gather people. And we know that from the first day that they lived in the house, they had dance performances, they had concerts in the house, they had people streaming in and out of the house. This was never a very private house. There were always a lot of different people in there. And this was something that happened throughout the time that the Schindlers, Rudolf and then Pauline, lived there. There were political gatherings. I mean, Pauline Schindler was very, very active in also in political circles. And so in a way, they always sort of saw their house or this place that they were creating as something that would do both shelter the individuals or the family, but also allow this incredible interaction with the world. That is one of the things that Pauline Schindler writes about in a letter to her mother several years before she actually met Rudolf Schindler. She talks about the activities in the house. And it is Pauline Schindler, as has been mentioned before, as I also mentioned, who set up the Friends of the Schindler House. And she was very specific about, she wanted the house to be a center for architectural education. So there was always this idea that this house really should be something that belongs to, in a way, to the world, to a larger, you know, to a larger circle. It's not a private place. And so I think that what maybe could be seen as a challenge, how do you take this sort of private place to a more public function, actually is not really that much of an issue here, because it was thought of as a public space.
That was one of the questions from the audience, actually contemplating the balance between providing public access to the house and preserving its physical integrity, which I think you answered that question, Frank. Another question is, what does Schindler have to teach us for the future?
Well, that's going to take about 3 hours at least, or maybe 3 days.
We should probably make a call.
I mean, Kaitlin, do you want to start?
No, I don't know about this one. Well, I'll take a start, and then I think this is a great one for everybody to pitch in on. This, I think, what we've been describing, and Frank, you also just represented this very eloquently. This is a space that, a place that the public can come and still feel very private. And you can, let's describe it, you can see that Schindler's telling us a few things in that statement. Number one, you can use a minimum amount of materials, cost, effort in the construction process if you know how you want this building to behave. I think, Frank, you described that Pauline had a vision of it before they even gave materiality and physicality to it. It had already had a concept of life to it, and that the physicality brought to reality. And I think that's an incredible lesson for us, but it takes knowing how you want to live, where you want to be, and then expressing that in a way that that's compelling. And so anybody want to take Cathy? I think that concept is really interesting because we haven't really described it, but there are rooms of this house that are actually outdoors. It's not really just a garden. The living room is contemplated as an outdoor room. So you don't need all rooms to have roofs and lighting and floors. You can use space to share and create these other spaces.
I would think that what can the property teach us in the future is probably going to continue to unfold, because when we know something, we build upon it, and then we learn something more. And that's going to continue at this property, and it's been giving for a century and will continue to. The unique qualities of it that might lend towards that change over time of understanding of it, we've already touched upon. What kind of emotion does it evoke, and what time of day might it be? The sense of scale and the authenticity that Kaitlin's been mentioning is really important. When you're in the space, it feels very immediate. The conversation is right in front of you. And there's something about that physical experience. Plus, I think the knowledge that Schindler conceived of these spaces as workspaces, as living spaces, the vitality of life was contained within them. There were not a lot of little boxes. They were narrowed down to your life occurred in the studio and in the outdoor space, which was a living room, patio, a living room, the same thing. And so I think in many ways, the fact that it is as daring and as fresh today, over 100 years later, is part of the story. I don't think we know it all. We're going to do our darndest to learn a very great deal about it, to shepherd it through into the future, but it's going to keep revealing.
I think just as an example, Cathy, one of the ways in which Schindler is able to achieve some of these spaces, if we look, for example, at the tilt-up concrete walls of the house, these are very early examples of pouring molds and making these concrete walls on the site. I mean, this is in the 20s. And I think, just by the simple nature of tilting them up and creating spaces that are both indoor and outdoor with the use of concrete is fascinating. And it holds up 100 years later. I mean, those kinds of things are still being explored today. So that's just one example.
Perhaps another is that light comes from every angle because of the clear stories, not just 3 or 4, but more.
But I think if we want to speak about what we can learn from Schindler, maybe we should look at him, or the sort of figure of Schindler, a little more carefully. I mean, first of all, architects, of course, don't exist in a cultural vacuum, and everything that surrounds them somehow shapes and influences their work. In the case of Rudolf Schindler, we didn't really talk about that, but he grows up in Vienna at an incredibly interesting time, the sort of the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. He studies with Otto Wagner. He studies with Otto Floß informally. He comes to the States to work for Frank Lloyd Wright. That was his plan. It didn't happen at the very beginning, but he works then in Frank Lloyd Wright's office at the time that Wright is in Japan for very, very long periods of time, working on the projects in Japan. Schindler himself never went to Japan, but he was exposed to Japanese aesthetics, architecture, culture through Wright, but also through many other sources. He also was very interested in indigenous architecture in the United States. He travels, he describes this, he writes to his buddy, Richard Neutra, who is still in Europe, about the indigenous architecture that he encountered, how he felt that this was such a important it was for him a very important experience to sort of see this. And it is very clear that all of these sort of different things that he was exposed to, in a way, and in a very unique way, come together in his building and his architecture. I think this is a really interesting model to think about and to learn of, or learn from. The other one is really his idea of sharing space, living together. This was at the time a unusual idea. It is becoming more and more something that we are familiar with. There are now really interesting examples, a lot of them in Europe, of people cohabiting, sharing living spaces, sharing kitchens, rather than each unit having its own sort of living space and its own kitchen, that you can actually sort of share some of this infrastructure that a house needs. And I think that is an extremely interesting thing to look at, in particular, as we think of how we want to live in the future. What are lessons to learn? And he did this in a very sort of matter-of-fact way 100 years ago. And it is something that still is kind of really, as I said at the beginning, it's a radical way of thinking about how to live, and that is, to me, very much something that one can today still learn from.
Thank you, Frank. I think you just really captured all of our hearts and why this project matters so much and why this property matters so much. And I think it still remains today a forward-looking building and architectural masterpiece, which is, I think, why we're all here today. I just want to share my screen one last time with you all. Oops.
If I have a couple more questions too, Emily.
Okay. Well, I wasn't sure if we wanted to conclude that
we
note.
can, but people are still on, and so if we want to ask the question, we can throw it out there.
Up to you all. I want to stay within a reasonable time frame for everyone, so it's up to our panelists.
What do you feel like?
Just ask the questions.
Okay. Cathy, someone asked Cathy Garrett's comment about the Schindler House embodying the changing attitude of conservation or preservation to modern architecture. Somebody wants to hear a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Well, I think it comes from Schindler and Pauline in how they conceived of and occupied the space over time, the property over time. So it's not, while it probably does apply to a range of properties, there are some unique qualities here which are very specific to this site. So the sense that space and occupiable environments are maybe indoors or maybe outdoors was not very common, and even still is somewhat limited. And it was absolutely fundamental to that property. And as a rigorous study, it neatly starts very, very finely defined. And as you move away from this pinwheel center, it becomes somewhat less so. So I'm not sure I'm completely answering the question, but in terms of the dialogue between architecture and landscape, I mean, the way that we see the world, they're different entities. And I think the way that this property was conceived, that line was very, very blurry. And perhaps that applies to some number of other properties, but maybe not every other property. This sense that architecture is about space, that was the currency, that was the raw material, to use Schindler's words, and how those things were defined, as Frank described, the tilt-up walls have an indoor and an outdoor, and Kyle as well. These things have bearing that we have this language to describe indoor and outdoor, but in fact, they're objects to define space. And so the relationship of the landscape, it's a term of art other than, and one I think that more and more on this property we should somewhat put aside, because it's really this collection of beautifully arranged elements that not only create the art piece that Frank described, but it was one to spend time in and to dwell in and to experience the movement of the sun and the change of the light and the experiences of a lifetime, two people's lifetimes, right through to their deaths. But also continuing on, it's a life in, offers a life now in which to understand art through MAC, particularly in their exhibits, but also as an art piece as a whole. It's a collection of elements, which it's a collage, a four-dimensional collage that continues through time. And landscape has a piece of that, and architecture has a piece of that. But I think the conversation, and certainly amongst the team on the CMP, has been very dynamic. And we've poked and prodded each other a little bit with these different attitudes. And I think we're finding this rather wonderful common ground in many ways. To my mind, these are the conversations that professionally uplift and inspire and carry us forward, all of us. And we hope to be able to convey some of that through the CMP.
There's one more question that's probably related to what you're just talking about, Cathy, and Peyton, who's been with us but silent, but we've mentioned him a couple of times and we're glad he's with us, is writing an answer as well. Do you think this house, if it were built somewhere else, would have the same effect on people?
No. No.
No, no, I think it's no, it's a product of its place and time.
Yeah.
For sure. And as I was listening to Cathy describe, I guess I'll share with all of you something that that it takes time to learn about the house. It's a very tactile house. The scale, as Cathy was describing, the scale is small, but like concrete sounds like a very cold object, and many of us are familiar with modern concrete that's very, you know, sleek and cool in color. As Kyle was describing, these concrete panels were poured on site and they were poured onto the slab that's there. And when you walk up to them, and I'll share something, a little tidbit in this pinwheel Cathy's talking about, he improved the technique of releasing the concrete formwork from the slab as he began pouring them. So when you start in the garage, you see there's texture to the interior of the concrete panels. You actually still see some of the burlap form, and some of the fabric had wrinkles in it. And he gets better and better at it as you go around the pinwheel to the Schindler studio, and you begin to see less and less of that texture in the concrete. But some of those early panel forms, you actually can walk up and you can see they have a light. The concrete walls have a life to them. And as Cathy was talking about the landscape, what the result of that is also in their 4-foot modules with the ribbon, the rooms have the same amount of texture as the landscape outside, and the same amount of character. So they're not, it's very seamless to feel that kind of scale as you move in and out. So that's, I just think the materiality of the object is also just an extraordinary, creates part of the extraordinary place.
Maybe to add something, the reason I said no is that an architect has to consider how one moves through spaces and moves through a building, and really you think about the choreography. And part of that is how you approach a building. And of course, when Schindler was building this, the city around it was very different. This has completely changed, as Cathy pointed out, but the approach to the building is very much part of how you experience the building. The fact that you go through a very lively street, and then you go through this alley, and then you come into this sort of very calm, quiet space. So this would be a very different experience if this were out in the desert or somewhere else, and you were in some kind of large vastness, and then you approach this house. The other thing that is really very unique is about the views that you have from the spaces out through the courtyards and into the larger sort of environment. That again is very different from location to location. And so these are things that are very unique to its place. And having this house somewhere else would lead to a very, very different experience. I think this is an important topic because it was actually, I believe, Gregory Ain who suggested in the 1970s that the house should be demolished or deconstructed and built elsewhere so that the house could survive. And these ideas have actually sort of been brought up on other occasions. Again, the house may be, because the context has changed, the house should be moved and it should be built somewhere else. I don't agree at all with this, because Schindler was very aware of the fact that the context would change. He knew that. That is why he built a house there. Pauline Schindler knew that. She saw that. She experienced that. And so the experience, if this house were somewhere else, were reconstructed somewhere else, would be a very, very different one.
Okay, I think we've taken all of the questions we can. I want to make sure Emily gets in her last word, and then I just
Thank you. Let
one.
me put us on our final screen share. Let's see. Can do a full screen here. Okay. Well, I would just like to thank you all for attending the discussion today. We're extremely grateful for your participation, and we really look forward to future FoSH and MAC events where we get the opportunity to discuss the Schindler House and all of the wonderful things that go into it. Thank you again to our wonderful speakers and all the work that you've done for conserving this architectural treasure. And to learn more about this project or get more involved, make sure to visit the website or visit in person. I don't know why I skipped to this page, but back to this. You can visit, scan either of these QR codes and learn more about FoSH and what we're doing on our website, or donate to the Legacy Project, which is also through FoSH, Friends of the Schindler House. But that is where we're going to leave you. Thank you guys so much for attending, and this will be posted online.
I'm going to put in a last word. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, as well as our panelists. And the conversations are so interesting. They can go on for hours. And so we invite you. We will do 2 more this year. One, I don't have the topic yet, in September, and then one in November, I think, are with Doris Cole. So stay tuned. You'll get emails from us. Please send us any comments if you're interested in a Schindler talk. It's not always, this was a very specific topic about the work that we're doing with MAC and FoSH together for this CMP, which we felt was very important to share with you at this point. But our topics aren't necessarily always about Schindler, but in the spirit of Pauline and Rudolf Schindler, who were inviting people to their house, as Frank described, for salons and all kinds of political discussions. And that's how we envision the Schindler Talks as well. So thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.